Hello and welcome to the BuildASoil YouTube channel. Today we have an FAQ for you, FAQ 10 for season 4. And I'm really looking forward to this one because this one is specifically on drying and curing questions. And we asked you on the last video to load me up with questions. And so I've got a whole bunch of them here. I've not read any of them. Dean sent it over. I've printed it out. And I just want to keep it real, so we're going to jump in and I'll answer these as best as I can. First off, thank you for asking. Thank you for participating. If you've been following us for a while, you'll know that I really treat the drying and curing as one of the most important steps, because if you don't get this part right, then all the hard work that you just put in was really for naught. And it can be a big problem. I know when you first start growing, you put all the effort into growing, and then it may be kind of a mad rush to figure out how to trim it and dry it and do all those things, because naturally we put most of our research into what seems like the hardest part, and that's the growing. But if you have a plan and you know exactly what to do and you've already prepared for the drying process, it's super easy to get right. And it's not rocket science, it's not hard. We're just gonna give you the process. And then depending on where you live, you might have different challenges. And so let's get started. Catch says, when hanging, if the buds are touching each other, do you separate them or you just let it go? If I was, say, separating stalks, individual stalks, and I had them really packed closely together, I would find problem with that and I'd rather space them out a little bit. But when I hang a whole plant, it seems like they keep enough space where it's not really a concern. And so use your best judgment. If you've got really thick buds, maybe you didn't top or you didn't bend at all, and there's one big one, and you have several of those that you pack next to each other and they're touching, it could be of concern. But a lot of times the way the plant hangs or the way the branches line up on a hanger, it keeps them enough apart. And so if you're using one hanger and you're putting multiple branches, it's okay if the branches are touching, but you don't want multiple hangers packed in on each other. So you want to have some area of airflow throughout it, and you don't want it entirely crammed into a spot. But if some buds are touching each other, it's not really a problem. So hopefully that answers your question. That was a really good question, by the way. M&S says, I grow huge plants outdoors here in southeastern Michigan. Awesome. I've been hanging them by a huge branch. Each branch looks like an individual plant. Would I benefit by hanging the whole plant? Probably not, and there's lots that we can discuss here, but let me read the rest of your question. I do have the room, and ironically, in October when we harvest, the relative humidity is in the 60s for weeks and the temps are relatively cool. The dry for me usually goes 12 days, then I buck in a paper bag, line buckets, and trim when I need to fill my jars. My hanging area is not heated, and I use an air mover to exhaust out and a fan to recirculate. Oh, this is really good. I think anybody should be able to diagnose their own environment and go through this process, and I feel like you've done a great job. You're probably just asking, but others will learn from it. So, first question, whole plant. When you're outdoor and the plant's large, it's less important to hang the entire whole plant. In fact, you might break one of your hanging mechanisms or the beams that it's tied to if you put too much weight in one area. I've had people put them on like the roof underneath in a garage and it's caved the roof in. There's definitely some problems. If you've got the room, I don't see why you couldn't do it, but here it's dry. I like to hang as much material as I can, especially when the plants are small. So to me, that's the whole plant. Outdoors, when I grow them and they're a lot larger, I definitely treat big branches like a whole plant and I hang those. I want some stalk along with the bud, and that helps hold some of the moisture. And then the whole plant, or even individual branches like you're doing, they add this structure where you don't have to really worry about spacing as in the first question. But I really do think the way you're doing it's probably ideal, because no matter what, you're not gonna go take that entire 5-10 pound plant down at once and go trim it at once. You're gonna have to break it into smaller groupings. And so I would say segment your work and hang clusters of it that keep you in the target range. And I know that every time I go to dry this time of year, no matter what I do, it's always a little bit on the hard to keep the humidity downside based on my space or whatever. Then I would fix that and I would maybe break out some branches from there. But if the opposite's true, I can never get it humid enough, then I want to put as much material in a smaller space, or I want to keep the whole plant hung, anything that I can do to shift it that direction. But anybody in any situation, you're gonna go on your weakest link. So if you're not able to keep the humidity up, then a smaller drying area with more plant in it will naturally give you a slower dry. Adding humidity would be the best, but if you try and add humidity in an open warehouse that's 10,000 square feet, it might be hard to do. So just consider your weakest link and correct that, and don't worry about being perfect. We're just trying to target it. And when it comes to 60%, in your question here, M&S, in October when you harvest, the relative humidity is in the 60s for weeks. Your weakest link might be if you have a day that rains and all of a sudden it spikes way above 60 and you haven't considered that. It sounds like you do, and it's not heated and you use an air mover to exhaust out and a fan to recirculate. It's perfect, and I bet you if you exhaust out, even on a rainy day, you can keep it down to 60. But my fear would be on a really good harvest year where you have a little bit more yield and it's filling up your drying area, and you happen to have some rainy days afterwards, and your humidity goes higher than 60, that would be my one concern that I'd want to plan for so that I didn't have mold. But if what you're saying is even when it's rainy, it's in the 60s and it's perfect, then you know what you're doing. And I would just target that as my weakest link and make sure I have a plan for it. The more growers that I know and the longer I've been doing this, I don't like to trim. Nobody I know really likes to. And so you kind of get over that perfection. And I've noticed that having extra leaf material on there almost preserves the terps a little bit. And then when I pull it out of bulk and I break it down for the jars, it's just phenomenal. So I do the same thing as you. Okay, next one, tuber. Tuber says, if drying in a garage with an empty 2x4 tent available to use, better to dry in the tent to dial in environment or out in the carport itself. Tuber, use the tent. Now, here's the caveat. If you've been growing in something bigger and your yield is gonna crowd that 2x4 where you can't keep humidity and airflow in check, then don't do it. Focus on your weakest link. If I were to put that and I had no 2x4 tent and I had to put it in the carport, I would just want to make sure I could keep it close to 60 degrees and close to 60% humidity. If I could not do that, I would choose the 2x4 as my optimal zone to keep humidity and temperature in check. You know your environment better than I do, so pick whichever one's easiest to control and make sure that if you're using that 2x4, you're not overcrowding it with the yield that you're putting in there. Richard says, hello, Jeremy. I'm close to the harvest now for my first living soil grow here. Awesome. It's a really exciting time to harvest your first grow. Well, first living soil grow. Either way, it's exciting. I live in a tropical humid climate, so I have just the opposite problem of humidity than in Colorado. Oh man, I would love to live somewhere tropical, but this is one of the things that I fear. Okay, would it be best to get as much leaf off right at harvest time before hanging it? I plan to use a dehumidifier and air conditioner in the drying room in order to shoot for the 60 Fahrenheit and 60% humidity, but I'm thinking of trying to stay ahead of any potential mold problems. Thanks for all you do for the community. Cheers. Richard, first off, thanks for asking. And second, really good. This is exactly what I want you to take out of these types of lessons, is that you should control your weakest link. And since yours is excess humidity, you want to do the opposite of what I'm doing and your quality will still be great. In fact, it'll be better than if you had followed what I do because I'm in a low humidity environment. So for those of you that are in a similar situation, I would seek out people that live in that environment, that know how to do this, that you trust, that are on point, and learn tips from them. But everything you're telling me makes perfect sense, and it's what I would do. I would remove as much leaf as possible. I would break down from a whole plant to individual branches. And I don't think I would go to to bucking down to nugs. I would leave them on the branches, but I would make the branches spread out for airflow. And that way I could have good airflow in my environment and really focus on keeping it down to 60%. So that's exactly what I would do. And then as far as your humidifier, if you've not done it before, my main concern would be making sure I do a dry run first and see if my humidifier could keep up and keep it under 60%. It's just something important. So hopefully that all works out for you, and really good question. I appreciate you asking. All right, so Bones, my dry started smelling like hay after day 4. I got a humidity controller and got the humidity back up to a 55% constant. Will the hay smell go away or is it too late? I'm on day 9 of dry now, still not completely dry. The stems bend but not snap. Oh man, this happens, right? And I think you did the absolute best thing you could do, Bones, so don't worry about it too much. You brought the humidity back up to where it should be. 55 is still a little bit low, and that will leave you probably just a little bit short of the duration of dry time that we're looking for. And here's what I do when I'm in that situation. When I'm in the 50, 55 range, I go till about day 9 where you're at. And if they're not snapping yet, I might go to day 10 or 11. But as I get closer, I kind of take a preemptive shot where I know I'm not ready to get that full stem snap. I put it into tubs and I put all of my material together. And what this seems to do when I lock it in there now, either I'll leave the lid cockeyed, or if it's not completely full, I'll snap the lid down. I'm trying to give it a few more days slower dry and those last few percentage points of humidity or moisture that's in there. So you might try and do that since you're on day 9, and the next couple of days, preempt it, put them in tubs, lock it down, still keep your humidity at 55 like you're doing, but leave the tubs in that environment. And that should buy you enough time to get it in that perfect spot where they're snapping, and then you can start to trim or leave it there until you're ready, whatever you want to do. And so I guess your main question is, will it still smell like hay? I think that you probably caught it early enough, and no matter what, here's some good advice for everyone that's listening. Even if you do this perfect, there's gonna be a period of time when you walk in your tent and it's not perfect. You should be able to get it to be loud by touching a little bit, but it's not gonna be like the day you harvested where it stunk everything up every time you walk in there, especially as you get into day 3, 4, 5, 6, right? But if you know it was drying too fast, that hay smell could be a real thing. And it may not come back to as optimum as it could have been. But I really do think that if you're able to slowly finish and you're on day 9 now and it's still not done, I think you're gonna be good. I think you're gonna get odors back and you should be really happy with it. But just know next time, if you're able to keep it constant, keep it from going hyper dry in the beginning, you'll avoid it completely and you'll have really, really good results. So, I will also say one more thing. A lot of this is genetic related. Some genetics is a lot harder to mess up drying. Like you take Gorilla Glue, I don't care what you do, it's gonna be loud. Some genetics, the terpenes are a little bit more volatile and it seems like it's easier to mess up. So the answer is always to do it right, but some genetics are a little more finicky, so don't be too hard on yourself, okay? Sneak says, you mentioned in the past you had a humidifier problem. And I too recently had the same problem and everything in the tent was moist for 12 hours. How did you deal with it? Oh, Sneaks, I'm so sorry. I'm really glad that I at least mentioned it so that maybe someone like you and me, someone else can learn from both of our experience and preempt it. Okay, I remember what happened. I set my humidifier to be on all the time. And I thought, I know, I'll be smarter than this and the way I'm gonna control it instead of controlling the humidifier, because I wasn't using the BuildASoil humidifier that has the built-in humidistat. I was just using like a Honeywell or something, and I really like it, but it's got like small volume. And so I figured worst case, it'll run out of water. But the way I was gonna control it was my AC Infinity exhaust fan. And I set it to be at like 59% or 60%. And then the exhaust should just carry any excess humidity out, and then I would just check the reservoir and fill up the humidifier. My exhaust fan turned off, and for whatever reason, the AC Infinity just decided to shut down, and so nothing was happening. And so when I got home from work, I noticed that the humidifier was going nonstop, but no air was getting taken out, and it was completely soaking wet. And so all I did was get the AC Infinity back up and running, and I put it on 100% speed, and I kept the airflow in there and I turned the humidifier off and I just exhausted it for a while to get the humidity way down as far as the excessive amount of moisture. And then I rebalanced it to 60% and I let it ride and it actually turned out pretty good. I think I caught it early enough where it didn't lead to any mold. And it didn't seem like the extra bit of moisture ruined the quality. I was really worried about the mold. I'm guessing I got a little bit lower result on the odor because of that, but it still turned out really well. So I hope that yours turns out the same. Follow up with me. I'd love to hear what happened. And hopefully it worked out. All right, next question. Ash says, hi Jeremy, I just wanted to take a chance to thank you for all the videos and inspiration. I've heard that it's helpful to use a wood moisture meter when drying and when the buds are 10 to 11% they are ready. What are your thoughts? Okay, I'm really glad you brought this up because I've failed to mention this in the past. I don't like doing this. I used to do it and I'll tell you why I did it. Part of my challenge is that there's a variety of moisture in the different bud sizes depending on how you do it. And when you do a slow dry and it's in the point where it's optimum at that 60% level in your drying room, you could let them go for 6 months there and it would be perfect because that's what the jar should represent. And so since I know that's what the jar should represent, 58 to 62, like depending on how you like your nugs. I know some of my buddies, when I get nug from them, it's really moist and sticky. And some of them like it just a little bit on the drier side. Maybe they roll more J's, whatever. There's some preference there. But when I know that target zone and I know that I can dry as long as it takes to stay, almost like I'm exactly in that jar, that's my preference. And it just works on every nug in there. Now, if I take this meter, it will also work as long as everything's dry. But when people start to think that maybe it's not ready yet, or it's like, oh no, it's too dry, and they start using the moisture meter, if it's not fully dried yet, the bigger nugs will have more moisture in them than the smaller nugs, and so you'd have to check multiples, and I don't like probing them. But I'll tell you why I tried to do it. I was using a triminator. I since just don't even really do that step, but I prefer the trim bag. It's a lot cheaper than an expensive trim machine, and it essentially is the same thing. It's just tumbling the herb and then screening the leaf out. But the triminator was really popular. We rented them out, and when people would run them, if they had a bad experience, it was usually because they didn't know how dry or how wet to put it in there. If you put it in too wet, it doesn't really trim. And if you put it in too dry, it just eats up all your herb. So they keyed in on this and they were teaching people to target those moisture levels using their Triminator brand moisture meter. And on the forums, everybody's like, yo, this is just a wood moisture meter. So a lot of people were buying those and they would do that. And I'm guessing that's probably an SOP in commercial facilities for some places. But personally myself, I never do that. when I was doing that, I wasn't as confident in the accuracy of getting what I was after. Like maybe the moisture was right, but that slow walk into that perfect zone where it's just like a jar is what's worked every time for me. And so that's what I shoot for. I mean, I could reconsider this. Maybe I can pick one up. I think I might even still have one and give some readings on what mine looks like so I could at least share the information. I might consider that, Ash, but I'm really glad you brought it up. These are really good. I'm super stoked all you guys commented. This is what I'm looking for because I feel like if someone watches this episode, even though I talk and ramble a little bit, I think these are gonna answer a lot of people's really nuanced questions that they may not have gotten answered before. Kevin, does the size of your plant affect the dry time? For example, I have plants that finished about 2 to 3 inches tall. I'm currently drying day 4 at 60 to 66 Fahrenheit and 58 to 65 relative humidity. Some of the plants have stem snap already. Man, there's a lot of variability here, and absolutely a smaller plant will dry quicker. And that's part of why hanging the whole plant is what we aim for, because usually in indoor grows, even in our last season harvest, most recent here, season 4, when we were pulling, I just trimmed one of them. One of the Fruit by the Funks was 14 ounces so far, and I haven't gotten through the others yet. That was just the first one. And that's a big plant. And even then, the whole plant works great. I could have cut it in half if I really wanted to, or take like chunks of branches off like we talked about earlier in this FAQ video. But when you get down to a really small plant, it's almost like you're hanging branches. And it's just such a small amount. And here's what's typically different about the smaller plants. A lot of times the smaller plants also have nugs that aren't as dense. And so that moisture is not as locked in there. So part of getting a good dry is getting genetics that are gonna produce good results and then growing them, following the BuildASoil way so that when you're done, you have a product that's representative of what it's gonna be like in the jar. It's got a good structure and density to it. It's got lots of grease on it. And that helps guide you into that slow finish. But if it's a little fluffy based on the genetics, it's oftentimes just the genetics, nothing you did, and it's a really small plant, that gives you like the trifecta of hyper dry. And the challenge is that if you really are at 60% humidity in there, it may just be perfect. And it just didn't take that long to get there, and I would just leave it for a little while. But you did mention some fluctuations. It's possible that it was on the lower end for a little while, and it's such a small plant that sped it back up, and some of those fluctuations were causing that hyper. I honestly feel like if you had it dead locked in at 60%, 60 degrees, and it was even a small plant, it would still dry in that same time frame, although slightly faster than the big plant. It would settle in just right. So those are my thoughts on it. Right away, yes, smaller plant makes a difference. Less density of the bud makes a difference. And it makes a bigger difference when your dry room has a fluctuation to it. Either way, I wouldn't overthink this. If it's a small yield or a small plant, I would just do my best, right? And then next time, we can do better. So good question, Kevin. Joseph says, been growing 3 years now. I always struggled with drying and curing. I was drying too early. Me too. My process now is to smoke some when I think it's dry. Immediately I know if it's too early by smoking. Did way better this time. How can I tell your buds are fully cured? That's really it. I love smoking them when they're fresh. And it may be that like some herb really does benefit from a few week hang time in the jar or longer. I personally prefer fresh. And so one of the things that I'll notice is right away, like when you just get that first rip, like were there any micro seeds or anything that maybe have like ruined the batch? How's the burn on moisture? And I will tell you that my ideal moisture level, it may be just slightly moister than that in my tub. So if I go right in the tub right now, like stuff that I'm looking to trim from this season, and I go break a nug off, it's gonna snap, it's gonna come off, but it might be just slightly more moist than I want, and the burn might be a little bit darker in color. Because of that moisture, it may not be perfect yet, but it tastes great. It has all the mouth coat, it has all the odor, and it's one of my favorite times to smoke it is right off the branch. But I know that when I go open that tub up, go through my trimming process, buck it down, and then finally get it bagged back up or jarred back up, it goes through a dry down period during that when I'm handling. And then worst case, if I feel like it's just a little bit too, instead of jarring it, I will just leave it open in the trim bin for a couple of hours or something while I'm working, or I'll open the turkey bag and leave it kind of open and move it around a little bit. So all of us are gonna have like our final phase check to make sure. And part of that is I'll break down some of the bigger nugs if I'm really worried about the moisture into smaller nugs, little things like that. But I will say that I have it just like a percentage point high on moisture in the tub so that it settles in just right into the jar. So don't overthink it too much, because basically you're trying to say, how do I know like I know it's ready to go in the jar? Honestly, if you're getting that stem snap and you're getting a decent burn, I think that's a really good insight. I think we probably should just smoke one. If you feel like it's way too wet, then yeah, wait a little longer. But I did want to put that one caveat that it should be just a little bit more moist than you want, because by the time you open the tub, bucket down, go through your process, at least in Colorado, it's gonna drop it just a little in that moisture, and then it's perfect. So, good question. Latrice says, if you were to over dry and have to rehydrate before officially curing, does that decrease the potency of the final product? No, not the potency. It increases the overall experience as far as if you get a loss of odor. And some genetics are more, temperamental, and so we're always trying to be careful. If you do get a dry down and you do have to rehydrate, I honestly feel like after rehydration, a lot of it comes back. And so if you've got an old tub that maybe you didn't tend to, an old jar, and it went dry on you a little bit because you left it open and were picking out of it, man, I'm gonna get so much for this, but I just throw like a piece of a tortilla in there. I'm sure a lot of people grab like an orange peel or something. I feel like sometimes there's a little bit too much moisture or a little bit too much like other terp on there that I don't want. So the tortilla just works great, and I always have tortillas. Otherwise, I've heard people say they take like a fresh cannabis leaf that has moisture and put it in there. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can rehydrate. You figure out the best way for you. I don't like using hydration, like silica packs or anything like that for the dehydration. I just like to, if I've overshot, rehydrate. That works better to me, and it does taste great. Like I've taken some stuff that dried down a little, I'm like, man, it doesn't quite have that odor because it's so dry. And I'll put a little rehydration on it, and I'll make sure it's all fresh, trimmed up for the jar. And I mean, it's like 95% as good as it was, as long as it was not degraded. Like it was just dry. It wasn't like old herb or something bad that's never gonna come back. So hopefully that helps answer your question. I think that's a really, really good one. Kurt says, another great season, thank you. You're welcome. I think this last season was the most hectic for me. A lot changing around here, and my wife's surgery, and I was gone. And so hearing that, I appreciate that. Thank you. We just wanna keep documenting what we're doing. I'm in Australia, where it's been averaging about 30 degrees Celsius, which is 86 degrees Fahrenheit during summer. With no air conditioning, my 4x8 harvest is drying out a bit fast, even at 60% humidity, and it's about 25 degrees, 77 in the tent. Should I raise the humidity to allow for a longer dry, or just jar it up after about a week? I'm drying whole plants, but the cola tips are a bit brittle, even though the stem doesn't snap. I did strip the fan leaves already because I was afraid of mold. Oh, these are really good questions. So I'm keying in on where you say you're drying whole plants, but the cola tips are a bit brittle, even though the stem doesn't snap. So a part of the secret here is, I'm guessing you have enough experience where you already know this. So for those of you that may not know, it's going to feel like it's too crispy around the edges and around the leaves and around the tips of the buds oftentimes. But there's still moisture in the center. And so what happens is, if we expedite it, because we go, ooh, it's a little crispy on the bottom bud or on the tips, and then we jar it up, in the jar, that moisture evens out and comes to balance. And so in biology, one of the things that we learn is nature likes that balance. That's why our skin gets wrinkled when we go in water. There's like a passive transport. Anyways, you can look all that stuff up, but in the jar, it's just gonna balance of moisture. And so whatever was trapped in the middle, where it was maybe a little excessive, versus where it was a little crispy on the edges, that'll balance out to perfection. So don't worry too much about that if that's the only issue. And honestly, if it's at 60% humidity, it's gonna be very hard for it to go below the humidity that's required. I know that it could get to a stem snap slightly faster because of the heat, and if there's nothing you can do about it, don't worry. That's just like your weakest link is the humidity, not the temperature. You can't control the temperature. And so I think what you're saying by saying, should I raise the humidity, makes sense, but I don't know if I'd risk it. I feel like the humidity is never gonna be a problem because it's gonna settle in right where it needs to be. And if you raise it up, you might delay it. You could, man, like if it was me, I would totally experiment, but I don't wanna tell someone to do that and have them mold up their crop. I honestly think if you just had it just a little bit higher, like 63, 64, 65%, and maybe not from day one. You know how day one when the plant's wet, it's already high enough on its own? Maybe jacking it like day 3, 4, 5, 6, so you already had a little bit of dry down and there's less chance of mold, and you kind of ride that back down to 60. You could extend it from, 5, 6, 7, 8 days all the way out to 14, 15. But it would be rad if you could find a way to lower the temperature. If not, I really do like what you're thinking. But my advice for someone that had not done it, no experience, settle into tubs when you think it's stem snapping, even if it's early, and then let it ride it back out for a little longer so that moisture balances. And you might notice when you get in the tub, some of the moisture comes back out more than you think. If that's the case, ride it out longer before the jar. So, great question, really, really good. Thanks, Kurt. Okay, Scott, next question from Scott says, for someone that is drying in a 2x4 tent, can you go straight to the jar once you hear a snap in the stems? Do you have to use tubs? This is a really good question. I don't know why I didn't bring this up. And lastly, should the tub lid be on or off? Looking forward to the next episode. All right, this is great. So For someone drying in a smaller amount where they like have no need to go to a tub, they just go to the trim bin, put it in the jar, go straight to the jar, you're done. It's perfect. You could add maybe 1 or 2 days on your dry time just to make sure that it's perfect, but meaning if there's a variety in thicknesses of branches, but honestly, if you've gone the full length at 60 degrees, 60%, and you're 2x4 and it's done, there's no reason to go to the tub. Only reason I do it is if I have too much, I know what'll happen is if the humidity turns off and then it starts to dry the rest of the plants while I'm working on trimming one because it's gonna take me multiple weeks to trim it, that could be a problem. And so I like to get into a tub to kind of lock it in. So that's the reason. That was a great question. You do not have to do the tub. And lastly, should the tub lid be on or off? I put the lid on. So if I'm going, it's basically, the reason why I put it on at that point, it's ready for the jar. So to answer your first one, put it in the jar. To answer your second one, since it's ready for the jar, if you don't have time, put it in the tub with the lid on. Now, where I keep the lid off is if I'm knowing my humidity is low and I'm preempting the jar by early pulling to bring plant material together. That would be in the tub with the lid cockeyed so that I didn't overdo the moisture. And then I would slowly shut the lid or towards the end shut the lid, right? So that's the full answer. Really, really good question. I'm super stoked you brought that up. Thanks, Scott. All right, Murphy says, I'm drying near a shower. The room is connected to the bathroom. I've got an outtake pulling the air out of the room. Just wondering if a spike in humidity is bad or a consistent relative humidity number is better. First off, consistency is much better. Secondly, if the spikes are occasional and they are brought back down right away, it's unlikely to cause a major issue. I wouldn't overthink it, but if your spikes are raising the temperature and it's steamy and it's full of moisture and you've got a lot of plant material packed in there, and then once the spike drops, the plant material is over moist for several hours and it's not good airflow, it could be a problem. You got good airflow and it just spikes 5-10% for a few minutes, 20 minutes or something, drops back down. It's almost like answering the previous question in Australia where he wanted to raise the humidity just a little bit to lengthen that time. Like, I honestly think we're just looking for a target. There's no perfect answer here. And I think that you're gonna have to trust your gut. If you think it's spiking so bad it's gonna mold it up, trust that alarm going off in your head. If on the other hand, you're asking what I think you're asking and that it's just barely spiking, not really an issue, man, I think you're fine. Your weakest link would be controlling that someday in the future, but it may not be worth it. It may just be fine how it is. So really good question, thank you. All right, we got 2 more. Anonymix says, have you heard of cryo-trimming? Yeah, using a freeze dryer to skip drying. And if you could, I'd like to see a comparison in the future. Yes, and we've wanted to do this. And so fresh frozen, there's other considerations there. So like a lot of people will just harvest and immediately go into the freezer. That way they can do fresh frozen rosin. I think what you're talking about is cryo-trimming. So you use a freeze dryer. I have not heard of cryo-trimming to answer this properly because I know what you're hinting at, but I'm not gonna be able to answer properly because I don't know the exact definition of cryo-trimming. We're shortcutting. And it's possible that for a standard operating procedure on large scale, that shortcut is significantly more standardizable than the big whole plant hang, and we're able to get better results than average for large scale. But on small scale, when you can do this right, I'm not positive I would want to do that. And if so, I would want to be really dialed in. So freeze dryers use sublimation. And so they're going to go up in temperature, down in temperature, and then that's going to cause like a sweating that happens at that low temperature drop that allows the moisture to release and dry at the same time. That's what freeze drying does. Freeze dryers are pretty gangster, and I imagine you could do some good work there, but I would default always to the tried and true, unless I had really good information proving otherwise. Now, where I do like using the freeze dryers for fresh frozen, and the process, if you don't know, which I'm guessing you do, but others may not, is you harvest the buds and instead of drying them, you put them in the freezer. And then from there, you immediately prepare them into bubble hash. So you're not actually drying the material, you're just freezing it, and then you're running it through ice cold water. You're breaking the trichomes off as gently as possible. You're collecting those, then pressing those into rosin. When it comes to cryo trimming, it sounds like you're actually using the freeze dryer on the nug, not on the rosin, and then you're gonna trim it afterwards. And my gut, like my gut from being around for a while, is that this is a no-no. But I think commercial would probably like to do this, even though freeze dryers are expensive. Anytime you can preserve quality and have something be done fast, it's good for business. So don't know. I'm curious what other people think about this. So, all right, last one. Zombie says, does flour not taste good until it's done drying? I'm 1 week into drying, 60%, 60 degrees. Plant smelled fire when growing, but I tried a nug and not any flavor really. Hope the flavor comes out when it's done drying. Ooh, this is a tough one. All of us steal nugs early. I actually grabbed some today off of one of the mangoes in Kim, and it was super hazy, sweet, and it's only been in there for a little while. It wasn't quite ready, so I plucked some. I was gonna leave it on my desk to air dry. And then, yeah, it doesn't taste quite as good, but it should taste good. So here's what I mean. When I've picked early, I've noticed that some of them will still taste good. It just doesn't burn very well and adds like a harshness, and maybe you just know that the potency is not there and it's not quite ready. But when it tastes bad or it has no taste at all, it may not improve when it's fully ready. So hopefully I'm wrong. But yeah, it generally doesn't taste as good. Maybe a pain to smoke, but you still should get some flavor. So hopefully it helps answer the question. Man, that was a good one. We had a whole bunch of questions on here. I think they're all super pertinent. I hope you guys really enjoyed this one. And if I missed anything, or you're like, dang, I missed out, load me up with more questions. I love doing these FAQs. I'd like to do more of them, particularly right now. I'm about to announce what we're gonna do for season 5, and that's coming up. That's gonna be huge. And when we discuss it, I think we're gonna have some questions about it. And we're also gonna have some lag time on getting that all set up. And so from now, while I'm finishing trimming and going over the harvest report, to when we set up season 5 after we announce it, this downtime would be a really good opportunity for me to do a lot of frequently asked questions, product reviews, anything like that. So if you've got more questions, put them in here. Otherwise, thank you so much for being a part of this. As always, like, subscribe, tell your friends about this. It helps the algorithm, it helps build us. And you know what happens is after people learn from us, we've noticed some people like to buy a few products from us, and it keeps the business going. And I really, really appreciate it. So thanks to each and every one of you. And until next time, I'll see you guys on the next BuildASoil FAQ episode.